Welcome to Phantom Fables. In a forgotten village, an old windmill stands silent by day. But when night falls, it erupts with terrifying howls that haunt the villagers. They call it the Howling Windmill. It was the year 1687, autumnal winds of wrath howling over desolate fields in Nieuwedorp, a remote village of the northern provinces of what one day would be the Netherlands. Time itself seemed to have stopped moving here. The air was heavy with the unspoken prayers of countless generations, and each stone of the cobblestone paths carried stories from long-lost generations. No story, however, was any more long-lasting or feared than that of the old windmill standing at the edge of the village. The windmill stood there as a somber sentinel opposite blood-red sunsets, massive sails creaking to the wind. The people named it de Molen, the Howling Windmill, as if anything were necessary in an explanation of it. And when each full moon reared itself before the darkness of night, dreadful, low-toned moans appeared to be wrung out from its primeval stones, so much so that it inspired terror to the stoutest heart. No one dared approach the accursed structure, not after what had happened 50 years ago, when the miller and his family vanished without a trace. They left behind nothing but bloodstains on the stone floors and the echoes of their final screams, which some claimed could still be heard if you stood close enough to its rotting wooden doors. It was into this atmosphere of dread that Yehoiachin, a young scholar with an insatiable curiosity, arrived with his companions, Neer and Obed. The trio had traveled from Amsterdam, armed with little more than a few books, some old maps, and their unwavering resolve to uncover the truth behind the legend. The journey to Nieuwedorp had been long and hard. The three men rode in a creaking wooden cart pulled by a weary horse, their breaths visible in the cold, damp air. "Are you quite sure this is wise, Yehoiachin?" Neer demanded, clutching his coat around him like a cloak. The drizzle soaked into his dark curls, drenching his already damp locks. "The villagers we passed on our way told us not to come here. They spoke of ghosts, curses, and, well, I'd prefer not to dig them up myself." Yehoiachin smiled, but the dark eyes, which seemed almost black in this dim light, betrayed a flicker of unease. "You know as well as I do, Neer, that superstition is the refuge of the ignorant. If we are to make our names as scholars, we must seek the truth, no matter where it takes us." Obed, Yehoiachin's younger brother, looked out at the bare fields stretching endlessly on either side of the muddy road. "It's not the stories that trouble me," he muttered. "It's the way the wind feels, as if it's alive, watching us." The three fell into silence as a gust of wind swept through the skeletal branches lining the road between the trees. Howling, that sound seemed to bring with it this strange, mournful melody, these cries of the lost soul. As they crested the final hill, the windmill came in view. It towered over the landscape like a harbinger of doom, the decaying wooden form swaying slightly to and fro in the gusts. The air was getting colder too, and even the horse seemed reluctant to move closer. Nieuwedorp itself was little more than a cluster of stone cottages surrounding a small, crumbling church. The streets were deserted, save for a few shadowy figures that watched the newcomers from behind curtained windows. As the rattling cart arrived in the square, an old man pushed himself out from the church entrance, leaning upon a gnarled cane. His ancient eyes fixed upon the travelers, suspicion and pity mixed into his gaze. "You shouldn't have come here," he rasped. "The mill doesn't forgive trespassers." Yehoiachin stepped down from the cart and brushed off his coat. "Good sir, we mean no harm," he said. "We are scholars, come to learn about the history of this place. Surely there is no harm in that." The old man shook his head. "History?" He spat the word as if cursing. "Here, the history is one of blood and sorrow. Mark my words. If you prize your lives, you will take yourselves off before nightfall." Neer laid a comforting hand upon Yehoiachin's shoulder. "Perhaps we ought to listen to him," he whispered. But Yehoiachin's curiosity burned too fiercely. He offered the old man a polite nod and turned to the others. "We've come too far to turn back now. Let's find lodging for the night and begin our work at first light." She took them into a small tavern on the fringes of the village, run by a middle-aged woman named Shlomit. She welcomed them warmly enough, but, as did everyone in the village, she had haunted eyes. As she served them a simple meal of bread and stew, she spoke in hushed tones. "You'll be staying in the room upstairs, but I warn you, keep your windows shut and your lanterns lit. The wind, it is not natural here." Obed shivered and glanced at the flickering shadows on the walls. "What do you mean, not natural?" Shlomit leaned in close, her voice barely above a whisper. "They say the wind carries the voices of those who died in the mill. On nights like this, when the moon is full, it calls out for more souls to claim." Nir and Obed exchanged a nervous glance, but Yehoiachin waved his hand by way of dismissal. "Superstition," he muttered. Later that night, as they settled into their small, drafty room, the wind began to howl. It rattled the shutters and seeped through the cracks, carrying with it a low, mournful wail. Obed sat up in bed, his eyes wide. "Do you hear that?" Yehoiachin frowned, but said nothing. He lit a candle and walked over to the window and peered into the darkness. He blinked once. He thought for a moment that he had seen a figure standing near the edge of the windmill. It vanished. As dawn arrived, the trio set off in the direction of the windmill with their lanterns and notebooks in hand. The further they were from it, the stronger the ominous feeling was becoming. The air was thicker, the ground below them was cold and wet, and it looked as though it must have rained recently, whereas the sky remained clear. By the large wooden doors, Nir faltered. "Are you really sure about this?" "Yes," Yehoiachin said with confidence. "All the answers we seek are inside." He pushed the doors open, and they creaked loudly, revealing the dark, musty interior. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and decay. Strange symbols were etched into the walls, their meaning lost to time. And then they heard it, a faint, distant sound, like a whisper carried on the wind. "Welcome." The heavy wooden doors of the windmill groaned shut behind them, sealing the three companions in darkness. A damp, cold air greeted them, carrying the faint but unmistakable scent of rot and mildew. The dim light of their lanterns flickered uncertainly, casting jagged shadows that danced on the cracked walls. Obed's voice cracked the uncertain silence. "Are we sure of this? It feels wrong in here." His voice trembled, and for a moment, he let the fear out through that hesitant voice. Yehoiachin, skeptic that he always was, had turned to his younger brother and said, "Fear is the reason these people remain bound with their superstition. What we will find here will free them from ignorance." He pointed his finger at weird symbols carved into the beams of wood. "Look here at these markings, they are no accident. Must mean something, though." Nir stroked one of the symbols, following the jagged lines forming a circle. "These look old," he said. "Older than the mill, maybe." Obed stepped back. His lantern cast its light upwards on stairs, curving into the darkness. "What about the sounds? Those whispers? Please tell me you heard them all." Yehoiachin hesitated for a moment, then shook his head. "The wind playing tricks on us, that's all it is." But even as he spoke, a faint, almost imperceptible voice seemed to drift through the air. A low, mournful whisper, repeating the same unintelligible phrase over and over. The three set off up the narrow staircase, the wood creaking ominously beneath their weight. The lanterns lit little more than the steps ahead, and the upper levels were dark. As they climbed, Nir spoke in a hushed tone. Did you notice how the symbols are concentrated near the base of the mill? It's almost as if they were meant to keep something contained. Contained? Obed asked, his voice edging upward. What do you mean, contained? Probably nothing, Nir answered hastily, although his face looked otherwise. By the time they arrived at the first landing, they entered a little round room. Rusting machinery strewed the floor, cobwebs hanging off the walls in shreds and tatters, as if drawn from some forsaken boudoir. The air seemed denser here, pinning them to their chests. Yehoiachin took a step forward, his lantern illuminating the desk, yellowed papers covering it. He took one of them and squinted at the faded writing. These are in Dutch, he said, translating aloud. The winds grow louder with each passing night. It is not natural. They scream as if in pain, and I feel their anger in my bones. The mill is cursed. We are all cursed. Obed shuddered. Who wrote that? It doesn't say, Yehoiachin said, laying the paper down. But it's clear they were as frightened as the villagers are today. A noise cut them off, a sharp rasping sound from above. All three froze, their eyes flying up toward the ceiling. What was that? Obed whispered. An animal, probably, Yehoiachin said, though his voice did not sound confident. Among the rubble, Nir found a leather-bound journal, its cover cracked with age. He opened it carefully, revealing pages filled with scrawled handwriting. This looks like a personal account, he said. Listen to this. March 3rd, 1643. The windmill is alive. I am certain of it now. At night I hear its voice, crying out in anguish. It calls for blood. It must be fed, or it will take what it wants. God forgive us for what we've done. Yehoiachin furrowed his brows. Fed? What does that mean? Nir flipped through the journal, his forehead wrinkling. There are pages missing, torn out like someone didn't want them to be read. Obed took a step back, his lantern casting long shadows on the walls. I don't like this. Let's leave before... A deafening crash cut him off as something heavy fell from the floor above, shaking the windmill to its foundation. Heart pounding, Yehoiachin led them up the second flight of stairs, his curiosity about the mysterious floors overcoming his dread. The rest followed, somewhat reluctantly, the flickering candles in their gloved hands barely lighting their passage. At the second floor was a peculiar circular arrangement etched upon the wooden plank. At its heart was a trapdoor, well hidden beneath another layer of grime and junk. Another floor below? Nir seemed perplexed. Yehoiachin knelt down and brushed away the debris, revealing more of the strange symbols. This trapdoor wasn't meant to be found. Someone went to great lengths to hide it. Obed shook his head. If they hid it, they had a good reason. Maybe we shouldn't. But Yehoiachin had already pried the trapdoor open, exposing a narrow ladder descending into darkness. The reek that poured up was vile, a sickish mix of sodden earth and rot. Nir covered his nostrils and pinched his lip. It's not quite right. Yehoiachin didn't react. He merely started down, shining his lantern on the adobe walls of the shaft. The others reluctantly followed, their descent slow and hesitant. When they reached the bottom, they found themselves in a small underground chamber. The walls were lined with more of the strange symbols, and at the center of the room stood an altar made of black stone. The air in the room was heavy and oppressive, the whispers growing loud enough to resonate off the stone walls. Nir moved closer to the altar. His lantern reflected deep grooves on its surface. These are not just symbols, he whispered, his voice shaking. They're sigils, protective sigils meant to seal something in. Obed drew back, pale. Seal what in? Before anyone could respond, Yehoiachin's eyes fell upon a small, rusty dagger lying upon the altar. He picked it up, his fingers tracing the intricacies of carvings on the hilt. This was used for something, he said. Some kind of ritual. Nir nodded, staring at the grooves in the altar. Look at how these channels are formed. They're made to gather something. Blood, perhaps." At that point, the whispers turned into a deafening roar, and the flickering of the lanterns was quite violent. The walls seemed to close in, and the air grew so cold that their breath became visible. Obed clutched his lantern tightly. "We need to get out of here. Now." But before they could move a muscle, the trapdoor above them slammed shut with a resounding bang, plunging the chamber into total darkness. And then from the darkness, a voice spoke, a deep, guttural growl that sent shivers down their spines. "You should not have come here." The door's heavy thud reverberated through the vault. The trio now sat in asphyxiating darkness. Lanterns had gone out in the hubbub, leaving behind nothing but the eerie glow of sigils etched into the chamber walls. Whispers that seemed far off, indefinite, were getting louder, sharper, cohering into intelligible words of a strange, throaty language. Obed grabbed Nir's elbow. What was that voice? Who or what was that? Yehoiachin, having trembled, got himself together. "Be quiet. We must concentrate." He reached for his lantern, got it, and tried again to relight the flame. His hands had begun shaking while his trembling voice said so. The voice came again, this time clearer and more sinister. "You trespass where you do not belong." Nir moved ahead, calling out into the darkness in a shaking voice. "Who is there? What is this place?" The response was immediate and chilling. "This is no place for the living. Leave, or suffer as they did." Before they could react, the sigils on the walls flared with a blinding light. The room around them seemed to dissolve, and they found themselves transported to another time. The chamber was no longer empty. Instead, it was filled with people. Villagers dressed in 17th century attire, their faces pale and gaunt. At the center of the scene stood a man in a black robe, holding the rusted dagger Yehoiachin had found. He chanted in a foreign tongue, his voice rising and falling like the howling wind outside. This must be the past," Nir whispered, his eyes wide with disbelief. The trio stood there in shocked silence as the villagers were compelled to kneel before the altar. One by one, their wrists were slashed, and their blood ran into the grooves carved into the black stone. "It's a sacrifice," Obed said, his voice barely above a whisper. "They're feeding it." "Feeding what?" Yehoiachin asked, but he already knew the answer. The wind outside increased in strength, growing more furious. The blades of the mill turned at unnatural speed, as if driven by an otherworldly force. The robed man raised his hands, his voice booming through the chamber. "We offer this blood to thee, O cursed wind. Spare our lives and take this offering instead." She saw only the trio's retreating backs and was back in the dimly lit chamber. "That's what the villagers were talking about," Nir said, his voice trembling. "The windmill isn't cursed, it's alive. They made a pact with it. And now it's angry," Obed added, stumbling away from the altar. "We must get out of here." But before they could move, the sigils on the walls began to glow again, this time in a deep blood-red hue. The room seemed to vibrate with an unseen force, and the whispers returned, growing louder and more menacing. Yehoiachin held up the rusted dagger, its blade catching the crimson light. "This dagger, it must be the key. If it was used to seal the windmill, maybe it can be used to end this curse." "Or it could make things worse," Obed countered. "We don't even know what we're dealing with." "Do you have a better idea?" Yehoiachin shot back, his frustration boiling over. Nir stepped between them. "Enough! We don't have time for this. If we're going to end this, we need to do it together." Debating their next move, the trapdoor above them burst open with a deafening crash. Violent gusts of wind tore through the chamber, extinguishing their lanterns once again. The whispers turned into a cacophony of screams, and the ground beneath their feet began to crack. From the darkness emerged a figure, a towering, shadowy entity with glowing eyes and a form that seemed to shift and twist like the wind itself. Its voice boomed through the chamber, a thunderous roar that shook the very walls. "You have disturbed my slumber. Now you shall pay the price." The entity charged at them, its presence choking and oppressive. Yehoiachin held up the dagger, the blade shining bright in the crimson light. "Back!" he shouted, though his voice trembled with fear. The creature paused, its glowing eyes narrowing as it regarded the dagger. "You hold the blade of betrayal," it said. "It was with that blade they bound me here, doomed me to endless torment. And now, you dare to use it against me." Nier stepped forward, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. "If this dagger can bind you, then it can unbind you too. Tell us how to end this." The entity laughed, a sound like the howling wind mixed with the cries of the damned. "You cannot end what has already begun, but you can take their place. Offer your blood, and I may let the others go." Obey withdrew. "No, there must be another way." Yehoiachin looked at the dagger, then at the altar. "Perhaps if we desecrate the altar—" "No!" the entity bellowed, its form expanding, growing more threatening. "You will not resist me." Unheeding of the entity's warning, Yehoiachin raised the dagger and struck down on the altar with all his might. The blade shattered on impact, sending a shockwave through the chamber. The entity let out a blood-curdling scream as the sigils on the walls began to burn with white-hot light. The windmill above them groaned and creaked, its ancient wood splintering under the strain. The chamber began to collapse, chunks of stone and wood raining down around them. "We need to move!" Nier shouted, grabbing Obed and pulling him toward the ladder. Yehoiachin hesitated, his eyes fixed on the crumbling altar. "Go! I'll hold it off." "No!" Obed cried, but Nier dragged him away, forcing him to climb. As they ascended, the windmill groaned one final time before imploding in a deafening roar. Nier and Obed barely made it outside before the entire structure collapsed into a smoldering heap of rubble. The two stood mute, looking in the windmill ruins. Now the savage wind was but a memory as a dead, unnatural silence came. "Yehoiachin," Obed whispered, and his face gushed tears down. Nier touched his shoulder. "He saved us. He ended it." As they looked back to exit, a thin whisper caught at their ears. Whisper light, almost negligible, yet surely Yehoiachin's. "It's not over,"